He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. Go inside, Rhea. Chapter 1. The Road Less Traveled. The wheels of the RV rumbled against the cracked asphalt as we drove down an endless stretch of highway. The sky was an expanse of gold and amber, the sun melting into the horizon like liquid fire, the kind of sunset that makes you feel like you're on the edge of the world. I leaned against the window, my bare thigh pressed against the cool leather seat. The warm wind rushed through the half-open window, tangling my fiery red hair. I let it whip against my face, enjoying the sting. It was better than silence, better than the weight sitting in my chest. Mom was passed out in the back, her body half curled on the small bed, lost in the heavy haze of her sleeping pills. She always took too many. It was easier than dealing with reality. And then there was Lorian. He gripped the wheel with one hand, the other resting lazily on the gear shift. The dim light of the dashboard cast sharp shadows across his face, making him look even more unreadable than usual. He was never one for conversation, but tonight, the silence between us was something else. I studied him, letting my gaze linger longer than I should have. The strong set of his jaw, the way his forearm tensed every time he adjusted his grip. I'd grown up watching him from a distance, never fully understanding the pull he had on me. But now it was different. I shifted in my seat, letting my tank top slide just a little off my shoulder. How much longer till we stop? Lorian flicked his eyes toward me just for a second. A couple more hours. I sighed dramatically. That's forever. A hint of a smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, but he quickly wiped it away. It's not that bad. I stretched my legs out, letting my toes brush against the edge of the dashboard. I knew I was pushing it. I always did. Do you even know where we're going? I asked, tilting my head. He exhaled a slow, measured breath. Somewhere quiet. I smiled. Sounds boring. He didn't respond. Instead, he turned up the radio, an old rock song humming through the speakers. I let the music fill the space between us, but my mind was still spinning. Somewhere quiet, somewhere far from everything. A place where no one could hear the things we weren't supposed to say. The night stretched ahead, endless and open, and I had no intention of playing it safe. Chapter 2. Shadows and Sparks. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky was streaked with deep purples and burning oranges. The heat of the day had faded, but the fire inside me hadn't. We pulled over near the edge of a canyon, a place so vast and empty it made everything else feel small. I'd been here before. Lorian liked to come to places like this, isolated, quiet, untouched. But tonight felt different. As I stepped out of the RV, I stretched, arching my back just enough to feel the pull in my muscles. My shorts had ridden up slightly, but I didn't bother fixing them. I could feel his eyes on me, even though he was trying not to look. Lorian grabbed some firewood from the back of the truck, his movements slow and deliberate. I leaned against the side of the RV, watching him. The muscles in his arms flexed as he stacked the wood, the flickering glow of the fire catching in his eyes. I liked making him uncomfortable. Stepping inside the RV, I checked on my mom. She was curled up under the blankets, her breathing slow, her body completely still. She wouldn't be waking up anytime soon. A strange feeling settled in my chest as I watched her. Pity, resentment, maybe both. I wasn't sure anymore. I grabbed a cold beer from the tiny fridge, popping the cap off against the edge of the counter before stepping back outside. Lorian had already started the fire, the flames dancing in the cool night air. He sat on a log, whittling a small piece of wood with his pocket knife, like he always did when he was trying to keep his hands busy. I took a sip of my beer and walked toward him, the heat of the fire warming my skin. It's been a while since we've been here, I said casually. Lorian glanced up at me, then back down at the knife in his hands. Yeah, a few months, maybe. I let my gaze drift across the canyon. Still looks the same. He nodded, tossing a small piece of wood into the fire. The flames crackled, sending embers floating into the night. For a while, neither of us spoke. Just the sound of the wind, the distant howl of some animal in the distance, and the steady rhythm of my heartbeat. Then I broke the silence. Are you angry with her? Lorian stopped carving. He didn't look up. Who? My mom. He let out a slow breath, staring into the fire. What's the point? I swirled the beer in my hand, watching the liquid catch the firelight. I don't know. Maybe there isn't one. The silence between us grew heavier. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged, tense in a way that made my skin prickle. I stood up, stretching lazily before taking a few slow steps toward him. I could feel the shift in the air, could feel the way his body tensed as I moved closer. You watch me a lot, you know, I murmured, tilting my head. Lorian's jaw tightened. You should get some sleep. I smirked, taking another sip of my beer. You didn't answer my question. He finally looked up at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. Good night, Rhea. I let my smirk linger as I took a step back. The night was long, and I was just getting started. Chapter 3, The Edge of Something Dangerous. The fire crackled, sending tiny embers swirling into the night. The canyon stretched out before us, dark and endless, like it could swallow secrets whole. I wasn't cold, but I pulled my knees up to my chest anyway, letting the warmth of the flames kiss my bare skin. The beer in my hand was almost empty, and my head felt light, pleasantly buzzed. Lorian sat across from me, leaning back against a rock, legs stretched out in front of him. He was staring into the fire, silent as always. He had this way of making silence feel heavy, like words unsaid were pressing against his skin, waiting to slip out. I liked pushing him. Tilting my head, I stretched my legs out, my bare toes just brushing his boot. He didn't move away, but I noticed the way his jaw clenched, the way his fingers curled slightly against his knee. I smirked. You're always so serious. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. You always say that. Because it's true. I took another sip, licking a stray drop of beer from my lips. You don't have to act like you don't enjoy this, you know? His eyes flicked up to meet mine, sharp and unreadable. Enjoy what? I shrugged, setting my empty bottle in the dirt beside me. Being around me. A slow, humorless smile touched his lips. You think too much. I crawled forward just slightly, feeling reckless, feeling untouchable. You think too little? His gaze darkened. For a second, I thought he might say something, do something. But then he just shook his head and stood up, brushing the dirt off his jeans. You should sleep? I sighed dramatically, leaning back on my hands. You always say that too. He turned away from me, but I could tell he was still listening. I grinned. You know, if you really wanted me to sleep, you wouldn't look at me the way you do. He froze, just for a second. Barely noticeable, but I noticed. I felt it in my chest, that electric charge. That push and pull tension that had been simmering for far too long. Finally, he turned back, his expression unreadable. Go inside, Rhea. I held his gaze for a moment longer, then slowly I got up. But as I walked toward the RV, I could still feel his eyes on me. And for the first time, I knew he wasn't looking away anymore. Chapter 4, Over the Edge. The night stretched on, deep and endless. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, its cry carried by the wind across the canyon. But all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat, steady, relentless, echoing in my ears. I couldn't sleep, not with the weight of everything pressing against my ribs, burning under my skin. Not with him so close. Slipping out of the RV, I stepped barefoot onto the cool desert ground. The air smelled like dust and smoke, the last embers of the fire still glowing softly. And there he was leaning against the hood of the truck, a cigarette dangling lazily between his fingers. He didn't look at me at first, but he knew I was there. I walked toward him, slow, deliberate. My tank top clung to me in the warm night air, the hem of my shorts riding high on my thighs. I saw the way his fingers twitched against the metal of the hood. "You always stay up this late?" I murmured. His lips barely curved. "You always sneak out?" I smirked, stepping closer. "Only when it's worth it." Finally, he turned his head, meeting my gaze. And just like that, the space between us changed. The air grew heavier, charged with something neither of us wanted to name. I leaned against the truck beside him, close enough to feel the heat of his body, but not touching. "Not yet." He took a drag of his cigarette, exhaling slowly. "You should go back inside." I tilted my head, watching him. "Why?" He let out a short, breathless laugh, shaking his head. "You know why?" I reached for the cigarette in his hand, plucking it from his fingers and bringing it to my lips. The taste of smoke and something intoxicating, lingered on my tongue. His eyes followed the movement, dark, unreadable. Dangerous. I felt my pulse in every inch of my skin. I knew I was pushing, stepping closer to an edge we couldn't come back from, but I wanted to fall. I held his gaze as I took another drag, then slowly exhaled, letting the smoke curl between us. "I don't think you really want me to go back inside," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. His jaw tightened. His fingers flexed against the hood of the truck. And then he moved. Fast. Before I could think, before I could breathe, he grabbed the cigarette from my hand and crushed it against the metal. His other hand found my waist, fingers pressing firm against my skin. I gasped, whether from surprise or something else, I wasn't sure. But I didn't pull away, and neither did he. For a long moment, we just stood there. His breath was warm against my cheek, his grip firm but not forceful. "If you had any idea what you're doing," he said, his voice low, rough, "you'd be scared right now." I smiled, slowly. "What if I'm not scared?" His eyes searched mine, looking for something: hesitation, uncertainty. But there was none. Only fire. Only the crash before the fall. His grip tightened for half a second. Then, just as suddenly, he let go, stepping back, creating space. A decision made in an instant, one I wasn't sure either of us believed in. I stared at him, breathless, heart pounding, every nerve in my body alive. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "Go inside, Rhea." I didn't move. Not at first. Then slowly I turned, walking back toward the RV. My steps were unhurried, unbothered, but I knew he was watching. I could feel it. And just before I stepped inside, I looked over my shoulder, catching his gaze one last time. This wasn't over, not even close.